when you look at all the cuneiform titles, right? So you can write Dingir, Damu, you can write the Mul Sukal means the constellation messenger. They're coming right out of star atlases. So you write all the alternate readings. You get the Son of God, the Anointed One, or Christ, treads upon the sea. And how did they know Jesus did that? Look up in the stars. You can see a picture of a guy named the Son of God and the Christ walking on water in the stars. In fact, every time you see Orion, he's walking on water. Did Mithras, who's the god that revealed precession of the equinoxes, is he Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh, who's stabbing the bull exactly where Mithras is, it's the woman, dragon, and the child scene. And that's directly out of Mesopotamian astrological tablets. There's a woman in the constellation in the form of Virgo, child star Regulus, and then on the other side of the child star is Hydra, the seven-headed red dragon. It's a seven-headed red dragon. Now remember, Muhammad was illiterate. He was taught pagan mythology from Salman al-Farsi, Salman the Persian. He's a magus, he's a magician. He's dictating these ancient myths to Muhammad day and night. It states it in the Quran in 10 different passages. The pagan Arabs, they didn't join Islam. They said, no, your Quran is myths of the ancients. You're recycling ancient celestial mythology, calling it the Quran.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by a special guest, John McHugh, author of the Celestial Code of Scripture, which we're about to get into today. And welcome, John.
It's great to be here, Neil. Thank you so much.
It's great to have.
It's great to be on the Gnostic Informant. I just found out about the podcast, and I just started watching. I deeply enjoy it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's good to have you on. We're going to get into some astrotheology and some scripture and some astronomy, astrology, archaeology, all those things, how they all interconnect and how it's all one big thing. And so take it away. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'll try not to be pedantic or anything, but the Celestial Code of Scripture, the subtitle says it all. The subtitle is the Astral Ciphar underlying the miracle stories of the Bible and Quran. And that's what the book goes into. The premise is basically this, that the epic miracles accounts that are recorded in the Bible and the Quran, they correspond to pictures, to blows in the oldest constellation lists from Mesopotamia, which are, of course, written in cuneiform on cuneiform clay tablets in the cuneiform script, and remember these are pagan constellation lists, and you see it in these monotheistic forms of religion: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what I'm basically saying, and what the book basically describes, is the Adam and Eve in the garden story, Noah's flood, Noah's ark, and every other story or element for that matter. Samson's slaughter of 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone, Jonah's 3-day confinement in a sea monster's belly, Jesus' virgin birth and sea walk. John, if you think of Revelation, John of Patmos, the author of Revelation, writes a story in Revelation 12 about a woman, a child, and a 7-headed red dragon. That's depicted in cuneiform star atlases. St. Christopher, the giant who ferried Jesus across a river. St. Christopher does that in the guise of Orion, who's a giant, walking across a river constellation, Eridanus. And then the Islamic claim that the Quran was based on a celestial tablet in heaven. There's a picture of that in stars, and Muhammad's encounter with the angel Gabriel. And this presentation, I'm just presenting to you as kind of a sampler, like one of those Whitman samplers, those little chocolate boxes. I just want to kind of hit the highlights, intrigue your audience, and bring up some discussion. If your audience likes the presentation, feel free to go on Amazon and purchase the book. And and go into further study.
And
It's
I'll throw
it's
the link in the description for everybody. The link's in the description, and I also have it posted, pinned to the top of the comments. So if you're looking for the link and you can't find it, it's right there. Just click on the link. You'll bring it right to the Amazon.
wonderful, and it's footnoted for the scholar. So I tried to write it not even as a textbook, but more as an exposition, as someone who came to this as a devout Roman Catholic. You got to remember, I was taught by a priest or a nun every year of my life from kindergarten through 12th grade.
Wow.
And I was not taught by a layperson until I got to college. So, and ironically, I ended up getting my master's degree in Near Eastern archaeology and Native American archaeology from Brigham Young University,
Wow.
which makes this even more convoluted. So, so anyway, when you think of astrology, I think everyone really does know that it originates in Mesopotamia. But there's secret sacred wisdom, that's arcane wisdom kept by the Babylonian astrologer that we often don't think about and don't know. The two main precepts that a typical person who loves astrology, loves reading the horoscope, loves reading about their sign, what they don't realize is when astrology originated in Mesopotamia, we're talking late third millennium, early second millennium BC, they make references to the starry sky as heavenly writing. They literally call it Shitir Shameh, which in Akkadian, the Akkadian language of Babylonian and Assyrian, it literally means heavenly writing. And they refer to astronomer and astrologer as a tupcharu. That a tupcharu is literally a writer. It's an author. So you're like, wait a minute. The astrologers and the astrologers of the ancient world were reading the celestial sky like it was a text, like it was a cuneiform tablet, a pictographic text. And it literally says that. And they go a little bit further. One king in particular, Assyrian king Esarhaddon, he's ruling in the early 7th century BC. He makes a reference. He says, I write my name in Lamashi writing. Lamashi it's constellation writing. And you're like, whoa, constellation writing. And you get the sense that he's divulging a secret. It's this secret that the astrologers were looking at the starry sky as a pictographic and literary text. And literally, it basically breaks down like this. And I highlighted it in yellow. Pictures in the constellations framed monumental historic events, and wordplay in the constellations cuneiform titles that imparted the action and details taking place in each still frame. So you might have 2 or 3 constellations in a picture, and the cuneiform titles have alternate readings. And when you write down all the possible meanings, you end up getting the Judaic miracle story or the Christian miracle story or the Islamic miracle story. So the idea that the constellations are pictographic scriptures is nothing new. We all know that, the 48 ancient constellations are still frames of events that the Greeks and the Romans believed were sacred history. They even had a term for it. And, for the Greek scholars who watch, I'm popping off the case ending. So, don't eviscerate me because I'm leaving the case endings off, because they change according to the tense of the noun. But it's called Katasterism. Katasterism just means placing among the stars. It's a deification. And the constellations are depicted with these deities performing, they're literally gesticulating the events that made them deities. Wow. That's how they got to heaven. And so you see it right there. I mean, this is just a sketch of the Farnese Star Atlas, second century. I'm looking at Perseus there carrying the head of Medusa. He's got a knife in his right hand. He's just cut off Medusa's head, and out of Medusa's head sprung Pegasus, the flying horse. So it's just an example. So the pictographic aspect of this, most people can grasp. What we don't realize is that this is the equivalent of walking into a Catholic church at Notre Dame and seeing the Garden of Eden story in the stained glass, things like that. When you see these, they're events that are supernatural, and so what I noticed back when I was in grad school, this is way back in the mid to late 1990s, like Epic of Gilgamesh. All right, well, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they slay Taurus, the bull of the sky. And there's a picture of it. It's from a cylinder seer. It's about 2000 BC. But one of the lines, it's actually line 155 from the Gilgamesh Epic Tablet 6, says that, like, after they slay the bull of the sky, Taurus, they tear out its Amiti Guana. Guana just means bull of the sky. The Amiti means shoulder. It's literally the shoulder of the bull of the sky. And they throw it before Ishtar. And I'm like, Ishtar, who's the planet Venus? I'm like, wait, that appears in the night sky. So when you look at Taurus it's a protome. It's a cutoff at the shoulder, just like the Epic of Gilgamesh states. And several times every decade, Ishtar, the planet Venus, stands in front of Taurus. Literally, Taurus stands in front of Ishtar, just like it says in the Epic of Gilgamesh. All right, well, that's interesting. It's like a still frame from the Epic of Gilgamesh can be seen in our present night sky. So a couple lines before that, as they slay the bull, what they say is, I think it's line 146, 145, and 146 of the Gilgamesh Epic Tablet 6. Literally, the line, I transliterated the cuneiform there, but it says, and the deity Gilgamesh, like a butcher breaking the tablet, brave and skilled, presses his knife in between the nape, the horn, and the slaughter spot of the bull. Well, the nape, the horn, and slaughter spot, the slaughter spot is a jugular. Well, I know exactly where that is. It's exactly where Mithras is stabbing Taurus in all of the the bull slaying icons. So you're going to say to yourself, wait a minute, did Mithras, who's the god that revealed precession of the equinoxes to the Greeks, is he Gilgamesh? It makes you wonder.
Also, let me jump in for 1 second.
Sure.
This is really blowing my mind. He's called the son of the morning, if I'm not mistaken, the dawn bringer. Isn't that what Lucifer is when he's the male version of Venus? The planet?
Yes.
Okay.
And let me just go one more step, since you just mentioned that. So I believe it's either tablet 6 or tablet 9 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But so Gilgamesh, who's stabbing the bull exactly where Mithras is, he ends up climbing the constellation Gemini, which in Mesopotamia is called Mashu. It's a twin, but it's a twin mountain. You've got to climb it to get on the ecliptic. And he hops on what's called the Cascal Dingir Utu, which is the road of the sun god. It's literally the ecliptic. So when he stabs Taurus, he's stabbing it at a specific point on the ecliptic. And by the way, Neil, he has a race with the sun god. So he goes in the underworld, he races the sun god to the surface of the earth. The sun god goes on its usual route. Gilgamesh goes in the opposite direction, and that's the direction that precession of the equinox moves. It's westward through the zodiac.
Right.
Yeah, so it's really a remarkable idea. So like, okay, well, that's intriguing. Then you get another story. You get Etana. The name in Sumerian literally means ascender of heaven, ascender of the skies. Wow. And he's depicted in cylinder steels being carried up into heaven by an eagle. All right, that's from like 3rd millennium BC. Well, you got the story of Antinous, who is a youth who was back at this time. Catholic priests would love this, but they had the practice of pederasty, which is the idea that an established male could take on an adolescent male lover, and nurture that person and have him as his lover. And Hadrian had Antinous. Well, Antinous ended up sacrificing himself for Hadrian, and soon after, they say his soul appeared as an asterism in the eagle constellation Aquila. So there's the earliest depiction of it on a European star atlas, an eagle carrying Antinous into heaven. But it's literally, this is literally depicted in our night sky.
Ah, I see. Now I know that when in Ovid's Metamorphosis,
Mhm.
at the very end of that book, you get these apotheosis events. You get Asclepius, Pythagoras, and then Julius Caesar. Is there any examples of Julius Caesar or Asclepius or Pythagoras having their deification moment being presented in the sky, or is it are they taking an old constellation and reworking it in that context?
I think they're reworking, recycling older information,
Yeah,
but 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 I don't know that for certain. I could certainly. What I think they're doing is they're taking a system, you get that Katasterism, that placing among the stars to become a deity, the Babylonian flood. So Jesus ascends into heaven. In fact, he goes through a couple clouds. If you look at it in the Acts of the Apostles, his ascension, and and that's how he joins his Father in heaven and takes his rightly place, no
right.
longer as immortal, but as the Son of God in heaven. You know,
I see.
so anyway, there's a great Sumerologist named Ben Alster. He passed away, I believe, in 2012. But he said something about Sumerian literature, and I'll just read the yellow section. As the evidence stands out, the earliest aspects of Mesopotamian literature seem to be exactly these: celestial function and wisdom literature. It would be a mistake to assume that astronomic observations could only be expressed through lists of explicitly stated numbers. Numerous Sumerian myths, hymns, and myths take place solely on the starry sphere. What
Mm,
he's saying is mythology is based on this idea of, Lamashi writing, this picture writing in the stars. So so the pictographic part of that Lamashi writing I described from Mesopotamia is pretty straightforward. It's pictures in the stars depict scenes from monumental scenes from history and the sacred history, really. But where does the wordplay part fit in? Well, to understand that, you've got to understand that Lamashi writing is based on wordplay. It's pictures and wordplay embedded in the names of the pictures. So to understand it, you got to understand the solemnity of wordplay in ancient Mesopotamia and the ancient world in general. So you're like, well, like where does that show up? See, we don't have that today. Wordplay to us is it's a witticism or a form of humor. If you're funny, if you use puns in a humorous way. But as someone who was raised devoutly Catholic, I turn to what Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel. He's talking to Peter. He says, you remember, Peter's name is Petrus. It means rock. And Jesus says, and I also say to you that you're rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Well, the Catholic Church takes that line as proof of Jesus creating the papal office. It's based on a pun. Literally, the papal office and Peter's place as the first pope is based on a pun.
wow.
That's a seriousness and a sobering concept that we just don't hold today. We only think of puns as funny or humorous, and it's not that way in the ancient world.
Right.
Um, so one thing that shows up, especially amongst astrologers and any kind of diviners in the ancient world, Neil, is this term amat nitzirti. It literally means hidden words. It's what we would call today puns, wordplay, double entendre. The fancy term is polysemy, and polysemy just means uh, more than one word meaning on a word or a phrase, and it's connected to another term, Paristusha Ili, which is the secrets of the gods. So hidden words are the secrets of the gods. If you found a pun, you found a divine revelation. Again, we just don't do that today. In the ancient world, it was common practice. So anyway, I'm going to try to scoot through the heavy duty stuff so that you can understand what my premise really is relating to the Bible and the Quran. So, so cuneiform writing, it's it's just inundated and permeated with puns, with polysemy, multiple meanings in a word and phrase. How that occurred is based on the way cuneiform writing evolved, right? So the Sumerians invent writing in about 3000 BC, and they're writing on clay tablets with the stylus. They're imprinting their Sumerian language written in the cuneiform script. But we find that there's also another ethnicity sharing southern Mesopotamian with them and increasingly immigrating into that land. They're a group that are speaking another language, the Akkadian language, which is what we today think of as the Babylonians and Assyrians. That's the language they spoke. So the Akkadian people accrue political clout in southern Mesopotamia until the first Akkadian speaking king ascends the throne in the city of Akkad, which is why his language is called Akkadian. That's where we get the language. And in fact, these Akkadian speakers, who eventually become the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they eventually not only overthrow the Sumerians, but they literally assimilate them into their own ethnicity. And by 1800 BC, Sumerian is no longer spoken. It's
Right.
retained as a sort of the language of science and literature, sort of the way that the Catholic Church
Latin.
retained Latin as the sacred language of the Mass, in
That's
which might,
fascinating.
yeah. So here's how it shows. Again, I'm trying to scoot through this fast because you do have to understand this to understand my premise. So I'll go with those. So Sumerian logograms and
Yeah.
lexical
Ask
equivalents.
one question real quick. Do you think
Yeah.
that that's the reason why you have for example, you have the story of Moses being put in a basket instead of drifted on the Nile? Do you think that that's why they're borrowing from these Akkadian myths? Is that why they think they hold these myths as sacred and they sort of want to rework them?
Yeah, and I not only that, you can look at them. There's a picture of them in the stars. You're like, oh, there's the flood boat. Oh,
Uh,
there's the flood hero. Oh, there's the birds that they released. They're all in the stars, every one of them.
that's interesting.
Yes, but yeah, no. So so one of the ways the Akkadian speakers retain Sumerian is they start to make these dictionaries in the early second millennium BC. So they use what's called a Sumerian logogram. There's thousands of them in cuneiform writing, and what it is, it's a cuneiform sign that stands for a Sumerian word, but it's listed with an Akkadian equivalent word. So, for instance, and by the way, Sumerian logograms are typically written in capitals, and there's Akkadian equivalents are written in italics. So that's why all these scripts are all different. So you're looking at the cuneiform sign on. By the way, every one of these 600 cuneiform signs has a name in the same way we have the letter A named A, but it says B is named B, but it says B. Well, they have that for 600 cuneiform signs. Now, the cuneiform sign on, well, that represents Shamu. It means skies or heaven in Sumerian, and it represents the word Shamu, which means skies or heaven in Akkadian. Now, if you didn't want to write out the word Shamu in Akkadian, you could just use the Sumerian logogram on, and it's a little faster to write. So it lets you write, it's almost little abbreviations. The same cuneiform sign can be read Dingir, which means God in Sumerian, and it's equated with the Akkadian word Ilu, which is God, deity, right? Well, that's great. Well, that's not the only thing that on means. They started equating the Sumerian logogram on with many other Akkadian words. Wow. So not only can it mean skies, heavens, and God, it can mean Yao, which is my or mine. It can mean Kakabu, star. It can mean Chibultu, ear of barley. It can mean Zukupu, which means impale. It can mean Sha, it can mean Saku, which is forbidden or taboo.
It's got to be a nightmare to try to decode all this stuff and try to translate all this.
Yeah, you get it. A lot of it you get from context. But whenever you wrote a cuneiform sentence, an astrologer would know that sentence could have hidden meaning underneath the cuneiform signs. So you're like, wow, that's not the only way. That's the problem, is that's not the only way punning shows up. The other way it shows up is this vast number of what we would call homophones. Like we have them, like 2, 2, and 2, like to your house, the word 2, like 2 donuts, and 8, too much, right? So there are so many, like I'm just using one example now. I'm using the cuneiform sign mul. That just means star in Sumerian, right? It's equated with the Akkadian equivalent is kakabu, which means star. But it can be mul. Then you look at that second cuneiform down, says mul 2. there are so many homophones that the cuneiform linguists had to invent a transliteration scheme that allowed you to ascertain what cuneiform sign was actually showing up on a tablet. So you can write mul, you can write it. It can also be read mul, written mul two. There's a mul three. There's a mul four. There's a mul five. There's a mul X, which doesn't show up in the lexicons. It's esoteric. So
Wow.
yeah, so and they have, and every one of those cuneiform signs has alternate readings. So when you write the cuneiform sign Mul, which means star, which is in front of every star and constellation, you get, it can mean star, it can mean writing, it can mean shine brightly, it can mean arrow, it can mean ornament, it can mean pierce, it can mean fruit, elated, a distant time, field, cow, month, blah blah blah. I mean, it just blows your mind. So if you look at Enumalish tablet 7, so if you look at that tablet, every word of that tablet, all 163 words from that tablet are based on punning. So what they're doing is they're taking 50 epithets for the planet god Marduk. Marduk is just it's the planet Jupiter, and one of its epithets, and I'll show you how they produced line 126 in the Numeralish Tablet 7. So they write his name, Dingir Nibiru. That's how you spell his name, okay? But they know that Dingir has other meanings, that the B sign in Nibiru has another meaning, that Ru has two other meanings, and that Mul has another meaning. And they just write down those alternate meanings, they arrange it into a coherent sentence, and they assume that exposes an aspect of Marduk's powers. Line 126, we want to read it in English, says, the god Nibiru. Nibiru just means the crossing, because it's the planet Jupiter when it's crossing the meridian. So they call it Nibiru, crossing. The god Nibiru, you don't have a verb being, so you have to insert the word is his star, which in the skies they cause to appear. So they're just busting out that name into all its possible puns, and then they're arranging those into a coherent sentence. That becomes scripture. It literally becomes a line of scripture in the Babylonian creation myth.
Wow.
So you're like, did this continue into the outside of Mesopotamia? Did it disseminate into the Greek or Roman world, or into the Judeo-Christian or Islamic world? Well, there's a phenomenon that scholars refer to called hostage astrologers, and what it means is, like, if I were a vanquishing king, the first thing you do when you overtake an enemy kingdom, you round up all of their diviners, all of their astrologers, and you try to incorporate them into your own entourage, get them to work for you, basically, because they're the best minds in the world.
Right.
So, so, um, so the question is, did this really happen? Well, there's two references in the ancient world where Homer is described as a Babylonian diviner who was taken hostage, probably an astrologer. In fact, the name Homer means hostage.
Wow.
So, so did it happen? I'm pretty sure Homer was one of these Babylonian astrologers that knew how to read the sky as a divine text. And then he learned how to read Greek, and he also knew this system, and he originated the Greek myths
And
in
then
alphabetic way.
Homer was so important that Alexander the Great carried around a copy of the Iliad with him on his travels that was personally handwritten, annotated by Aristotle. Can
Wow.
you imagine what was in that thing? What kind of notes were in that thing?
That would have been dumbfound.
Yeah.
Yeah, read that. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And then I know that a lot of your viewers are very much into the origins of the Bible and the mysteries of the Bible, and of course Daniel, because he is a hostage astrologer. He's
Yeah.
taken by Nebuchadnezzar II. He works his way up the ranks and becomes the supervisor of all of the Babylonian astrologers and diviners. All of they're called him Manu. We would translate it as magicians, but he becomes the best.
Can you
So
can you kind of put Joseph on that list too? Because Joseph, he comes down to Egypt. And he's in jail, and then he's asked to translate myth, not the stars, but dreams. Would you
Yeah,
consider that to be sort of similar?
yeah, dream interpreters. They were another kind of diviner. Anybody who could predict the future fit into this category.
Right.
The one skill the astrologers had is they could also read the past. They were doing kind of an astrology in reverse with the constellations.
Wow.
So that's kind of one way to think of it. So you're like, well, and I knew I was on to something back in grad school. So I'm like, I'm looking at Aries. We think of Aries. It's the golden fleece flying ram, right? Like, who could believe that as literally true, right? Well, if you were a Greek or a Roman, you did. And so you can see it literally embedded in the cuneiform title for Aries. So in Mesopotamia, Aries is a hired worker constellation. The constellation title is literally written Lu Hunga, and you can see it there in the lower left of your screen. It literally means man, hired worker. And he was a hired field worker. He's standing next to his plow. His plow is triangulum. It's the constellation right next to Aries, which is triangulum. And his field that he's destined to plow is the field constellations, the Pegasus square. Okay, so it's right there. Now, cuneiform is a very cumbersome script to use. So they're always trying to abbreviate to make it a little easier, which is part of the reason why they like Sumerian logograms. They even try to abbreviate them. So they try to abbreviate Luhunga to its first cuneiform sign, Lu. Well, they got grammatical rules, just like we do. Like you start, you start a sentence with a capital letter. Well, one of the things you couldn't do in Mesopotamia is you couldn't use a determinative as an abbreviation. So you couldn't say Lu2. The Lu2 sign means man in Sumerian. So you had to, you just don't read them. They're silent signs. And I don't know how, it's almost like a silent E is the only equivalent I can think of in English. Anyway, so they're like, all right, well, we're going to abbreviate this cuneiform, this constellation, Luhunga. We're going to abbreviate it to Lu. But there's 10 different cuneiform signs that can be read Lu. So they use Lu number 1 instead of Lu number 2. So Lu, the first cuneiform sign, doesn't have a subscript. So if you ever see a cuneiform sign and there's no subscript, it's Lu 1. It's the first cuneiform sign, the most frequent one. So Lu phonates the word man, but it can also be read, it's a different cuneiform sign. It can be read Udu, and Udu means ram. And every historian of astronomy knows that's how the hired worker became a ram. It's from a pun. But I kept going deeper. I was like, wait a minute. Lu has a whole bunch of different readings. One of them is C. And C is the Sumerian logogram that means to change into or to become. So you find the words, the hired worker becomes the ram. That's specifically how the hired worker turned into the ram on Greek astronomical texts. Because remember, guys like Homer knew cuneiform. So they're like, we can come up with a whole new mythology using this celestial system of reading and writing. So, but that's not it. Like, then you have this cuneiform sign Lu. It's got various forms. One is up the top on this screen right now. So if you look at it, it's a composite cuneiform sign. It's the Lu sign. It can be read hired worker. It represents the word ram. It also can be read becomes. But if you look at the square portion of it, that's a specific cuneiform sign. It's called Lagab. Lagab means sha'u in Akkadian, which means flying around. So now this hired worker, this ram, is now a flying ram. And then the crossed sign in between the Lu sign that you look up at the top is the bar sign. And bar means golden fleece. And like, the hired worker becomes the flying gold fleeced ram. That's probably, remember, it's embedded as constellation writing. This is hallowed writing. It's inviolable. You cannot question it.
Do you think
I'm sorry.
Do you think there's any connection between this and the Jason and the Golden Fleece myth that we have?
Yeah.
Yeah, from he's
Yeah.
Hesiod, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely.
And then not only that, you have Ammon, who's the ram god, and Alexander becomes the son of Ammon when he's in the desert and he meets the oracle.
Yep.
I wonder if that word "become" and "ram" are sort of. I wonder if if this is a pun on the ancient Babylonian mythology. I wonder if they were aware of this stuff and they were writing when whoever was writing what is it, Arian, I think it is, or Katasterism, whoever wrote the Alexander Greek romance, whoever that was.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the author.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that Homer and a cadre of Greek scholars. Those are Hesiod's probably one of them.
Yeah,
Hesiod's probably one of them. They they knew
absolutely.
this Mesopotamian Lamashi writing. So you go further, and you can just keep busting it down. Like if you look at the full cuneiform sign, if you wrote that on a cuneiform tablet and you wrote Ares' full cuneiform title out, it'd be Mul Luhunga, right? So there's all these different alternate readings. Mul can be read Nab, C. Hun can be read falls into. Lu can be read Udu, which is ram. It's got Lagab in it, which means flying. It's got bar, this cuneiform sign bar in it, which means golden fleece. It can be read C. C means to become, but it also means suhuru. And suhuru is the word curly. It's Phrixus. That's what curly means in Greek. This means curly, And then the synonym for this man constellation, Lu means man, is Eli, which means to carry or carries. And Eli, if you render it into Greek, can render hele. And it's all in the footnotes on how you do that. They've got cuneiform to Greek um, uh, cuneiform tablets that are, Sumerian and Akkadian into Greek.
Wow.
So then you lay down all the puns and you get the flying gold fleece ram carries Phrixus, curly, hele. Hele falls into the sea. If you remember on that trip, Hele doesn't make it. She falls off and drowns.
Right.
So,
Are you familiar with the ram in the thicket?
yeah.
Is there anything going on with this? And I know that in the story of Abraham, he's about to kill his son, and he looks over, he sees a ram in the thicket. But also, when they excavated the city of Ur in the 19th century, they found, which is the city Abraham is from in the Bible, by the way, they found a giant idol of a ram in the thicket.
Wow. And you'd have to wonder if that's part of I have not pursued that, but I've got rest of my life is going to be just every chapter in the celestial code of scripture becomes its own book. So like Jesus celestial, you'll see Jesus walk. Orion walks on water 700 years before Jesus, and you'll see that as a picture of it in the stars. But I'll show it a little bit later. But this is what I'm trying to get into. So you're like, all right. So now we left the paganism. I just wanted to just wet your whistle, to this. But then you're like, the celestial Garden of Eden. Well, remember, Eden means stepland. Eden's not. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a Sumerian logogram. It's the Sumerian logogram that means. It means steppe or backcountry, or you could probably translate it wilderness too. But steppe land is probably the best translation for it. So you're like, let's go back to Ares. There's our hired worker. There's our plow. There's our field. Right next to the southwest of that. Remember, I'm always looking in the stars, and I have to remember whether or not I'm looking on a map or in the stars. So, Ea is southwest of the field constellation, the Pegasus Square. That Ea is the god who creates the flood, and cuneiform star atlas say Ea is Aquarius. It's unequivocal, like there's no doubt. And if his Sumerian's name's Enki, then Enki's Aquarius too.
Wow.
So you're like, all right, well, that's cool. But then you think of the other readings for these cuneiform signs. Remember, Ares was abbreviated as Lu, means man. Well, that's the word. That's what Adam means. Literally, Adam means man. Is there a man in the stars? Yeah, he's Ares. And I'm like, it can't be this easy, right? So I'm looking at the cuneiform sign for the Pegasus Square, which is it's a field that the hired worker was supposed to plow, right? The cuneiform sign name is Gan. Well, that's the Hebrew word for garden. So I'm like, oh no, you gotta be kidding me, right? So I got a guy named Adam, and I got the word garden right there in the cuneiform, on a cuneiform tablet. And then you look at the epithets for Ea, the water god that causes the flood. One of them's Eden. Well, Eden can be read May, and May it's called a free form of the Sumerian verb of being, so it can be rendered he will be, and that's Yahweh. That's what Yahweh means. Yahweh literally means he will be. It's a call performative, so it's always described as a call performative for the most part, and it just means it's a future. It hasn't happened yet. It's in the process of happening or something to that effect. So it literally means he will be. So you have Adam, a garden, and a guy named he will be, or Yahweh, a deity named he will be up in the stars in this tableau, right? So then you look at a little bit closer at that Gan constellation. Remember, Gan means Hebrew and garden. Now, remember, in Babylonia, the constellations are considered writing. And if a constellation replicates a cuneiform sign, that cuneiform sign becomes its astroglyph. It's astroglyph, right? So the Pegasus Square constellation is, it looks like the cuneiform sign Lagab. It's a square, right? And there's a lot of evidence where Lagab is considered the astroglyph for the Pegasus Square constellation, right? So you got the garden, astroglyph Lagab. Lagab can be read Ni, which means can be read Nigin, which means east, and it's the Sumerian logogram for the Akkadian word Bamatu, and Bamatu is a synonym for Eden. So they would have known that the Lagab and Eden meant the same thing. And remember, Eden just means steppeland or like backcountry. So literally, you have the words a garden in Eden in the east. And my argument is they're taking that cuneiform and they're translating it directly into Hebrew, and that's how you get line 2:8 in Genesis. Genesis 2:8.
Have you ever heard of you know what gematria is, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you ever heard of the so-called math in Genesis 1 where it talks about the Gan Eden? If you take the gematria of that and divide it, I don't know if you divide it or divide the tree of knowledge, which is, I can't remember what the hell that is in Hebrew. But if you take gematria between the two and one of them divides into the other, you get the golden ratio exactly.
Interesting. I can believe that. I'm no. I've never done gematria. I mean, I know what it is.
But it shows you how sophisticated these myth writers were. They were putting math. They were putting astronomy. They were putting all these super sophisticated things into the scripture, and sort of making this thing divine in its own way by that.
In alternate routes, in alternate avenues.
Bringing it all together.
Yeah, and I'm only looking at, there's only so many lifetimes you have, right? So I got one lifetime. So this happens to me, because of my Roman, my Roman Catholicism. I'm so into trying to explain literally what the Bible is saying, and there literally is a garden in Eden in the east as constellation writing, as Babylonian constellation writing. So you go a little bit further. So that's basically what I'm saying is when you translate those puns, you get line 2, Genesis 2:8, right? So you go a little further. Well, how did Yahweh Aquarius end up in the garden? Well, you look at cuneiform astronomical text, they refer to the garden constellation. They refer to that Pegasus Square constellation as the Shubat of Aquarius. It's the dwelling of, the residence of. So you've got Yahweh Aquarius dwelling, in the garden. And that's probably how that idea came in there. And then you can just keep going off of that. Remember, there was that little plow constellation that's triangular. Well, in this tableau, the plow fits in that tableau because it's part of the whole garden field thing. And that Alpine constellation, which means it's a Sumerian logogram for to plow, also means to plant. And because remember that Gan constellation I was talking about? Well, because it's shaped like a box, it also represents the word box. And an alternate reading for that is Akka, which means to plant. So Yahweh Aquarius planted a garden in Eden in the east. Those words are literally written in the stars. And my belief is they're translating them directly into the Hebrew, and you can keep going. And I don't want to just, beleaguer your viewers with just text after text. I want to get to the more, sexier stuff too. But you can find the words Yahweh put there the man whom he made, which is how Adam gets in the garden. And where's the serpent come from? Well, Eden means stepland. Well, the Akkadian word for that, literally the Babylonian and Assyrian word for stepland, it's Tseru. And Tseru is the word for serpent. It's the same word. Really? So you end up with the serpent is literally embedded in the name of one of the names for the garden, literally the word Eden. The Akkadian word for
That's
Eden.
where you get the whole serpent being in the garden from.
Yep, that's it. And by the way, all the words he speaks are there too. But I that that becomes its own book, and I'm not going to beleaguer your viewers with all of the word plays. That's they're
Wow.
all in the footnotes. And I got an amazing artist. She's a Native American artist, actually, up here in Salt Lake City. Her name's Elizabeth Hardy, and we put 157 pictures together. I'm doing screen captures of reconstructions of the ancient night sky, and it was during COVID quarantine. So she's doing all these drawings, and we're trying to do it over the phone and over the internet, and she still managed to make all these amazing drawings. So my hat's off to her. I love working with her. She's awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, you can keep going there if you want to find out how the rib was taken out of Adam to produce the woman. That's all up there. Again, it's all based in Aries' cuneiform title.
I can't help it to it makes me think. So sometimes you read the ancient text, you read the Genesis, and the way it's written sounds very strange. Like it doesn't make sense for someone who just thought of this on the spot. But when you think about how it comes together from other ancient sources, and then all of a sudden the reason why it's so strange and peculiar that's why it's because it's being taken from other areas and put together into this one spot like a little puzzle piece. So that's
Yep.
how you get it. That's why it's all so strange, written so
Yeah.
weirdly.
And what you said about gematria, like I'm only looking at one aspect of it. I'm
Right.
not saying that there's just this. There's multi layers to this
So
stuff.
lots of layers, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll just move along. And the word fruits up there, the word forbidden fruits up there in the middle of the garden. That's it. Again, it's all comes out of wordplay. It's meant to be read. It's not really meant to be shown just in pictures, because it just starts to become a little pedantic, and I don't want to bore your viewers. So, um, but the word fruit in the middle of the garden forbidden are embedded in all of those word plays for that garden constellation, that Pegasus square constellation. So, um, and so is the tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and evil. Every single one of those can be traced to wordplay on the titles. There are several different ones, several different titles for the Pegasus square. Remember, that's a field in Mesopotamia, but it its cuneiform sign reads garden in Hebrew,
Wow.
and so that's where it all comes from. Again, there's other stuff I'd like to, since this is a sampler. I just I'm not trying to be haughty here or anything, but I
No, you're fine.
recommend your audience go to the book and read the book. I think you'll find it interesting because it's not written as a textbook. It's written as an expose, as I encountered this stuff going through my childhood and then into grad school and stuff like that when I came across all this stuff. Well, my favorite part is the cherubim and, well, I guess it would be cherubim in English, and the flaming turning sword. Like, if you excavated a flaming turning sword, like that would be unequivocal. So where are you going to find this sword that just flames, it's on fire, and it turns back and forth eternally? You can find it in the stars. So when you look at those lexical texts where you find Aries, remember I was talking about Aries? Well, there are a few different abbreviations for Aries. One of them is just flat out Hun. It's the titles of Aries is Luhunga. It means man hired worker, but they shorten it to just one of its cuneiform signs. Usually it's Lu, but it's also sometimes Hun. So when you look at the lexical entries, you get the Sumerian logogram Gi next to the word Wubu, and it just means prince or very important person. And so when you translate that into Hebrew, you get Girub, Girub, and the G's become a K. So it's Go becomes a K. So you get Kerub. It's cherub. It's our word for cherub. It's what we would call cherub. And the eem ending is just the plural ending in Hebrew. So whenever you see an eem, it's just like our version of S. So the cherubim, there's a whole bunch of them. There must be at least, three, because it's not in the dual form. It's at least three. So it's cherubim. It's plural. So there's cherubim, the words embedded in Aries. But remember that Lagab sign I was talking about that replicates the square garden? It's that square cuneiform sign you see in the center lower portion of your screen.
Yeah.
Well, that cuneiform sign is also read Gir, which means sword flaming and turning, and it's also read Nigin, which means east. When you put all the word plays together, you get Yahweh placed the cherubim and the flaming turning sword east from the garden, because that's what it says in Hebrew. It says east from the garden, not of the garden. But so anyway, that's just kind of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And so I just thought we could just take a look at Noah's Ark and flood waters. So one of the things that's always interesting about the flood story is it kind of comes out of the blue. The Sumerians don't talk about it. So they invent writing in 3000 BC. Then in the middle of the 21st century BC, you get the Sumerian king list talking about this great flood that divides time into antediluvian and post-diluvian eras, right? Well, the wet region of the night sky is contiguous. So when you look at the 8 water aquatic constellations, you get the dolphin, the goatfish, they're all in cuneiform star atlases. The southern fish, you get Ea Aquarius, he's the water god. You get a sea serpent constellation, you get the river, and you get this boat. Now, we call the boat the Argo, but what's interesting in Mesopotamia, the boat constellation is called the Magor boat. It's just a cargo ship. It's basically a cargo ship, maybe a barge. But what's interesting is there's a crown constellation in Taurus. It's the Hyades asterism. The crown is spelled in cuneiform, it's spelled Agu, and it means crown, but it also is the same exact word. It's a homonym that means devastating flood. So you got to wonder if they weren't reading about a devastating flood in the stars. The reason I argue that that's possibly how it's happened, there was basis for my master's thesis way back in like the year 2000 or something like that. But so when you look at this Magor constellation, this is really fascinating. It's one of the really remarkable because you can see it in our own night sky. So the cuneiform signs, the Sumerian logogram Magor, it just means literally, the cuneiform sign Ma2 means boat. And the Gor sign, it's literally the Gor 8 sign, right? So it can mean dove, but it can also mean flood. It's a devastating or destructive flood. So literally the word Magor means flood boat. It's the original flood boat in the oldest flood story. This is the name of the boat. And it says flood boat. So if in case you were wondering, what's the name of the boat? Well, it's called flood boat, So that's pretty hard. Now here's what's interesting. In the Sumerian myth Gilgamesh and Aga, a Magor boat gets its bow chopped off. So this constellation, so here's what you got to understand. So this original flood boat, it's listed as a constellation in the southern region of the night sky. It's described as a deity. It's the original flood boat, and it gets its bow chopped off. So you got to be thinking hey, let's look for a gigantic deified ship floating around the southern region of the night sky that has its bow chopped off. Well, when you look at the Argo is a big ship constellation floating around in the southern region of the night sky. It's described as a deity and has its bow chopped off. The whole front of the ship's cut off, just like the Magor is described in Sumerian literature. So it's very likely the original Magor boat, the original ark, became, the Magor, what we call the Argo. By the way, the Akkadian word for the Babylonian and Assyrian word for the rear of an object or the stern of a ship would be arku. When you translate arku into Greek, you get argu, you get argo. It's how we say argo, but it's pronounced argu.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so it's the same word. It just means, but
does that have any connection with the Argead dynasty?
I don't know. I don't know about that, but I can tell you that
there's a god that they're descended from, Argead or Argead.
Oh, again, I have never looked into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never looked into that, but that would be another avenue for someone else to explore. That would be a phenomenal avenue to explore. So all of a sudden you got a devastating flood. The wet region of the night sky is perceived as a devastating flood. So they become celestial floodwaters. You have the flood boat in the form of Argo floating around on the eastern side of those celestial waters, right? And then you get to later in time, you get to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and all of a sudden they start calling the flood boat another name. They start calling it an Iku. They start calling it a field. And remember the field constellation, remember the Pegasus Square, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a field, right? Well, there's no such thing as a field boat. They don't make them. They're never listed on any water transportations or anything like that. So the Pegasus Square is a field, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, this is what the Ark is. The prototype for the Ark is an Iku, a field, which would mean that the Ark, since fields are cut into 60-meter squares, it would mean that the original Ark was a 60-meter cube. And you can try to figure out how that floated, and kept everybody alive and kept all the life on Earth, all the seed of life on Earth.
Right.
And you start looking at it, you're like, wait a minute. Celestial floodwaters, Agu, that's in Taurus. You can see it up there towards the center, top of the screen where you see Taurus, right? The crown constellation is Agu. It's also the word for floodwaters. Wait, there's another, there's a box floating on these celestial floodwaters. So the box constellation, the Iku constellation, remember the field? Well, it's also the word for box. One of the ways to read box is Ma, and Ma is the Sumerian word for boat. So you have this box boat, and that becomes the which the Ark in the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't even make any sense. It's a 60-meter cube. Like, it doesn't even make sense until you come to the stars. Then you're like, oh, it's floating on. So they looked up. They said, yeah, there's an ark, a square ark floating on the celestial floodwaters, unequivocal. This is absolute proof. The deities have revealed that to us. So we need to write that down. And so anyway, that's one of the interesting. And if you want to know the title, so the Hebrew word for the flood, for the ark, for Noah's ark, is Tabot. The archaic word would have been Tabot. And that comes right out of the cuneiform. So if you look at the top of your screen there, you see Mul / Te Iku. So if they were writing the field constellation or the box constellation, they could write it Mul Iku. Now, that cuneiform sign Mul, it's the Mul 2 sign. It can be read Te. And they would have known that an abbreviated form of box is the P sign. So the alternate forms of the cuneiform signs can read Te P or Te Bot. And Te Bot, literally what you have is a constellation, is a Babylonian constellation that's getting rendered into Hebrew as Tebot. They know that the cuneiform sign is named Te. They know that a form of the word for box is the word read bot. So Tebot becomes the original ark, and that's why its origin is unknown, because it's not a Hebrew word. It's coming out of this Lamashi writing, this constellation writing, according to me, anyway.
Right.
So this elucidates one of my most famous passages, because I've excavated, in Syria, I've excavated ovens. In Jordan, I've seen in excavated ovens a tanur. So in the Quran, the floodwaters come out of an oven. And you're like, whoa, that doesn't make sense. Floodwaters flooding the earth coming out of an oven. So these ovens are like the size of your kitchen table. They're circular, and they look like little, they almost look like little, remember those clay volcanoes you used to make when you mix, that's what they look like.
Right.
So then you put it up there with that Iku constellation. Remember that arc, that square arc constellation? And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. The arc constellation is the Iku constellation. One of the meanings of Iku is carries floodwaters. It's also the word for box or chest.
Wow.
That's equated. Yeah, a synonym for it is the cuneiform sign Sheed, which also means box or chest. But Sheed can be read gear, which means oven. So you literally have the words the oven carry floodwaters. Now remember, Muhammad was illiterate. He was taught, pagan mythology from Salman al-Farsi, Salman the Persian. He's a magus. He's a magician. He's dictating he's dictating these ancient myths to Muhammad day and night. It states it in the Quran in 10 different passages.
Right.
And in fact, at one point, his wives are complaining. They're like, dude, you're never with us. You're always with Salman. And he's always dictating these myths to you. And before he could get converts, the pagan Arabs, they didn't join Islam. They said, no, your Quran is myths of the ancients. You're cycling ancient celestial mythology, and
Yeah.
you're calling it the Quran.
That's so crazy.
So that's where probably Salman. That's where you get the Quran, Al Quran, the recital. Muhammad's illiterate.
And it's not even just that. They're reciting some of the Greek legends too.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it's just crazy. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, Alexander the Great's one of the chapters in the Quran. So,
Dual Al-Qarnayn.
yeah,
You
two horns.
pull up the Greek Alexander Romance, and one of the versions of it, which predates the Quran, it talks about how Alexander stood between two mountains and prayed to the sole God, and said, "Bring up," or whatever he said. He prayed for there to be a wall put up between Gog and Magog. All of the literary elements from that story, you see it in the Quran. Two mountains, Gog and Magog,
Yeah.
praying to the sole God. Alexander's depicted on his coins as having two horns.
Yep. Two horn. Yeah.
So there you go. You had that story. Then you had this another story where it talks about the seven sleepers in Asia.
Yeah.
Sleeping for how many years and they woke
Yeah.
up. You got that recite. So all of the Quran is like this little recital of all these ancient stories, but
Yep.
putting them in Arabic.
Yeah, and I'll get to it later in the presentation because a lot of the Quranic chapters are. I mean, one of the chapters in the Quran is called Al-Baruj, which is the zodiac. Like,
Yeah.
could you imagine, reading like there's the book of Genesis, there's the book of Exodus, there's the book of the zodiac. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, you're like, whoa, I think I know where this is coming from.
Right.
Anyway, so I'll jump into another myth, and I'll try to go a little faster because again, the point is to get the big picture here with you,
Right.
Neil, and the the viewers. So Samson executes 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Now, that is one of my favorite myths in Catholic grade school because he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. So you could run around when you're in 5th grade and say, "Yeah, ass," in front of the nuns, and you could say it with impunity and didn't get slapped or anything like that. So it was like everybody would like fight over for this, because you had to do, heroic biblical figures. So there'd be like a squabble over this one, So you look at the name Samson. So you read the Hebrew right to left, right? So it says Shimshon. Well, the WN at the end it's the diminutive. It's like the et on kitchenette. It means little or diminutive. So when you say kit, you got kitchen and you have kitchenette. Kitchenette just means little kitchen, right? Well, Shimshon just means Shemish, as the SHMSH, that's son.
Yeah, Shemesh means son. That's still
Yeah, so it just means little son. That's what his
Wow,
name is. It means little son.
son. That's so crazy.
So you're like, all right, well, is there a guy named Little Sun up in the stars? Well, that would be a big yes. When you go to that crown asterism in Taurus, right? So the Hyades asterism is a very distinct asterism within Taurus, right? Its Akkadian title is Agu. As we said, it's the crown. It also means devastating flood. But in Sumer, as a Sumerian logogram, it's written Main. And I got the cuneiform up there. Well, Main means Agu, which is crown. Main means Shemesh, which is sun. And Main means Sharu, which simultaneously, Sharu is the word king and is also the word infant. So you got the word infant son embedded in Taurus.
Wow.
So the Hyades is probably this guy named infant son, who we get it in the Greek, translates Shimshon, which is Samson in Greek. So all of a sudden, the Hyades assumes the form of this warrior, right? But there's more to it. The cuneiform, the Sumerian word for Taurus is gu. It's gu-for, but it's gu-for, right? Which means bull, but also means warrior, and it also means name, like to name. So you have name the warrior infant son. You know what I mean? So it's very likely how the author of uh, the book of Judges came to the idea that Samson was named infant son, that he was a warrior, right? Well, you might say, well, that's pretty cool, but where does all the jawbone stuff fit in? Well, one of the most, the Hades asterism, it's literally, I'm sorry, it's kind of funny. It's literally called the jawbone of the bull constellation. So you're like, well, gee, this was hard. So like, oh my God. So
Wow.
jawbone of the bull. Well, one of the cuneiform signs for bull is Piri. It's gear no. It's written with the cuneiform sign gear 3. It's read Piri, but it's gear 3. It can be read bull and it can be read donkey. So the jawbone of the bull is simultaneously the jawbone of the donkey.
That's
And also, one of the Sumerian terms, if you look in the lower left, is EC. Whenever you see capitals, it's a Sumerian logogram. It means it's getting read in Sumerian. It just means jawbone in Sumerian. However, EC, if you translate it, the East into Akkadian, you could read that as jawbone of the, and C is a Sumerian logogram for donkey. So it literally reads jawbone of the donkey. So
wow.
there's two different forms of jawbone of the donkey embedded in the titles
You get
for the Hyades asterism in Taurus, the jawbone of the bull.
you get a lot of donkey
So
imagery, and
yeah. So anyway,
I said you get a lot of donkey
yeah.
imagery in ancient Israelite stories for some reason. I don't know why they love the donkey for some reason.
Well, I mean, it was a real pack animal. It was a real thing. It was an important pack animal.
Yeah.
But you know, and I'm just going to show the one section where it says Samson grabs the jawbone of the donkey. Well, remember, you know, the bull constellation. Samson is embedded in the bull constellation. The Hyades is an asterism that's housed within the bull constellation. Well, the Akkadian term for bull, one of them, there's about 10 different titles for bull, but one of them is Lu. And Lu forms a homophone with the logogram Lu, which means grab. So they would have said, oh, well, Lu can be read Lu, which means grab, which means man, means warrior, it means a whole bunch of other things. So Hyades equals Samson or little son. It equals jawbone of the donkey, and it also means grab. So you get the word Samson grabs the jawbone of the donkey, right? And then, you know, you look at the brightest star in the Hyades asterism, in that jawbone of the donkey asterism. It's the Aldebaran. It's the eye star. It's literally the bull's eye. Well, the cuneiform, the Sumerian logogram for eye is Igi, which also means 1,000 and also means to kill. So you have Samson is, yeah, and by the way, Lu, remember I just told you that Lu can also be red man. We saw that a bunch of times already. So, so you get the words Samson kills 1,000 man, and that's literally how it's written in the Hebrew. It's not plural. It's not men. It's man. It's ish. So there's your Samson kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. So like anyway, there's another myth. So you have Jonah swallowed by. For me, this gets really interesting because you already know the mystery inside of the Jonah story. The Hebrew words for Jonah say he's swallowed by a dagdagdol, which is a giant fish. But the Greek and the gospel version and early iconography, they say something different. Even Jesus says that Jonah was swallowed by a ketos, a sea dragon, right? And there ain't no doubt what he got swallowed by. When you look at Christian iconography, Jonah is getting swallowed by a dog-headed sea serpent. And I assure you, no fisherman ever caught that beast. It doesn't exist on earth,
Yeah.
right? And even Jesus said that's what he's swallowed by, right?
Yeah.
Well, where do you find it? Well, it's Ketos. It's our sea dragon. It's the sea dragon constellation, right? So how did the authors of the biblical authors come to view a sea dragon as a big fish, and the Christian authors who are writing in Greek come to see this as a ketos, as a sea dragon? Well, it's embedded in the cuneiform writing. And if you look a little closer, you got to know first that the name Jonah means dove. It's literally the word dove.
Oh
So
wow.
remember that Argo constellation? Remember that Magor constellation?
Yeah.
Well, the cuneiform sign Ma means boat. but it's got an esoteric meaning as well, which is prophet. So you have the prophet dove. So the Argo is also named the prophet dove or the prophet Jonah. So obviously the Argo embodies Jonah, right?
Wow.
So then you see, where's Jonah in the sky? Well, if you look over there on the left part of your screen, Jonah is embodied in the Argo, right? In that Magor boat, which became the Argo, right? There's a river constellation between him and Katos, the sea dragon, right? Well, in cuneiform astronomical texts, especially Enumerish, all of those, it's a 7-tablet story of creation, the Babylonian story of creation. There are 3 sea dragons created. One of them becomes Hydra, the water snake. One of them becomes another sea dragon that we identify as Katos, and another one probably is Draco the pole star. It's the dragon wrapped around the pole star. But when they're described in the collective, they call them Mushmak. So you can see here how you get 2 different renderings of the same meanings, right? So Mushmak. So mush is literally, it's typically the word for snake or dragon, but it's also a type of fish. It's probably an eel. But the cuneiform can be read, giant fish. So if you knew cuneiform, you would know that that really meant probably some kind of eel. It was a giant fish. An eel's a giant fish. It's got gills, right? But it also means, giant dragon, which is how it gets rendered into the Greek, okay, as a giant dragon. So that's probably how the early Christians came to see Ketos as a sea dragon, but the authors of the biblical story of Jonah rendered it. They're trying to conceal their knowledge, so they render it as a giant fish, and that's probably where it came from. You got the dual meanings for mushmak. So now Jesus says, one of the things it says about Jonah is the sign. Jonah is going to be the only sign you get when the Pharisees they're complaining to Jesus and they're saying, "Give us a sign, show us a sign." Jesus says the only sign you're going to get is Jonah. Well, how did he know Jonah was the sign? Well, you just look at the cuneiform title for the river constellation Eridanus. The E3 sign is one of the cuneiforms. It's a Sumerian logogram for river. You can see it up there. The sign name is E2. E2 just means sign. It's an astrological sign. So Eid can be a river, but it has an alternate reading that's also Gor, which means dove, which is Jonah. So you get the words Jonah, the sign. And Akkadian doesn't have a verb being. You have to insert the word is. So you literally have Jonah is the sign embedded in the river constellation, alternate readings for the river constellation. So the only way Jesus would have known that is if he was a magician. He'd have to be a magician. Jesus would have to be a freaking magician, right? So you're like, well, everyone who didn't convert to Christianity and stayed Orthodox Jew or remained pagan totally believed Jesus was a magician.
Right.
In fact, in early, Christian art, he's often depicted doing his miracles with a magic wand.
Yep.
Literally shown in this picture from a glass plate. This is I think 3rd century, maybe as late as 4th century, but it's around 300 AD. But he's raising Lazarus using a magic wand, So because everybody thought of Jesus as a magician, and that's he probably knew Lamashi writing. He's Jewish. He's probably of the tradition of Daniel, who passed that down to neophytes who preserved it. So just wanted to, so that's anyway. So I'll move into the Star of Bethlehem and the stellar tableau of Jesus' nativity. So the idea that, everybody says, oh, it's a conjunction, it's this, it's that. What's the Star of Bethlehem? Well, the Star of Bethlehem is only mentioned in Matthew. So it moves for about 3 months. It leads astrologers from the east, goes to Jerusalem, gets to Jerusalem, then it hangs a left and goes another 5.5 miles and stops over Jesus's house. And you're like, Nah, no star does that. Not possible. So you're like, well, wait a minute. Could this be written in Lamashi writing in the stars? Well, when you look at Leo, the brightest star in Leo is Regulus. Literally, the name of it's literally the king star. Okay, it's literally written Sharu in Akkadian. However, the word Sharu also means infant or child. So the star simultaneously means child and king, which
Wow.
is exactly how Jesus is described in the book in the Gospel of Matthew.
Right.
But it's also described with the Sumerian logogram May, and May can mean it can mean king, and it can also mean anointed one. So it becomes the Christ child king. So that's exactly how Jesus is described. And remember, Matthew and Luke, the authors of Matthew and Luke, had no idea how Jesus was born. The only people present at his birth were Joseph and Mary, and they were long dead. And they tell two different stories. I mean, Luke tells an entirely different birth story from Matthew. And so you have this Christ child star embedded in Regulus, right? Well, that's all cool. Well, right next to this Christ child star is a virgin, Parthenus. Virgo is Parthenus in Greek, the virgin, right? But her northwestern stars embody the pregnancy goddess in Mesopotamia. Her title is Aru. The word literally means, the name Aru literally means pregnant. So suddenly, Parthenus, because of Lamashi writing, embodies a pregnant virgin
Wow.
standing next to a Christ child star. And you're like, I'm pretty sure I know how they got the birth story of Jesus. Okay.
Uh,
So now this is where it gets really bizarre. Like, you know, the the cuneiform title for Virgo is obscene. It literally means pharaoh. It's an agricultural pharaoh. But they often shorten the cuneiform signs. They abbreviate, right? Well, if you abbreviate obscene to just ob, one of the readings for that is Uno, which means virgin, but it also means Moratu, which means bitter. It's the word for bitter, and it's also the word for sea. So literally, you have the word the virgin bitter sea. Well, that's what Mary's name means. Mariam in Greek comes from the Hebrew Mariam, bitter sea. It means salty water. You can't drink it. That's all it means. So the pregnant virgin, bitter sea, is sitting. She's a pregnant virgin, and she's right next to a Christ child star. Right. So you're like, all right. And I'm giving you the fast pass version of this. It's chapter 12 in my book. But got a Christ child star, got a pregnant virgin named Mary. So how did they know that this star went before the Greek literally says the star led them being the astrologers, until having come, it stood over the house where the child was, right? So every one of those words is embedded as an alternate reading for the cuneiform signs for Regulus or Leo. Mostly it's Regulus.
so mind blowing.
Anyway, I just so that's the Star of Bethlehem. But remember, Luke tells an entirely different story. He says Jesus is born and laid in a manger, right? Well, right next to the Christ child star, that infant up there, that Regulus, just to the west of that is M44 in Cancer, and that's described as a fatne in all the star atlases in Greek. That's a manger. So the manger. So Luke's story is up there too. They're using the same picture story.
So I got to ask you this: when
Yeah.
Luke and Mark are writing their Gospels, do they have access to some sort of book that has all these things written in them? Is there some sort of atlas or encyclopedia of constellations that they're? How are they doing this? This is really sophisticated
Yeah.
work.
So the astrologer's curriculum. So you think of Sumerian ending in about 1800 BC, but the astrologer's curriculum is carried into the 3rd century AD.
Wow.
Startling. Yeah, there's evidence for it into the 3rd century AD, especially in Syria, which is it's
Where it all happens.
It's where it all happened. It all happened in Syria. So you get alternate readings for the cuneiform signs for the infant, but remember, this is a king star. Well, that cuneiform sign is Luga, which means king, but it can also mean fine cloth. The the constellation that houses that Christ child star is Leo. It can be read Ah. And that cuneiform sign means lion, but it also means in. It can also be read Lebu. And Lebu means lion, but it also is the verb wrapped, to wrap up, right? So where do we find out the semeion, which, by the way, in Greek means constellation sign? So the semeion that's going to mark the Christ child star in Luke's gospel, he says it's an infant wrapped in cloth lying in a manger. And that comes right out of Luke's gospel. But you can read it as Lamashi writing in this picture story in the stars. It's Virgo, Leo, and a little bit of Cancer. And all the other, Joseph's there too. So are the choir of angels. They're all there too and everything. But I didn't. It would take too long to explain all that.
Right.
Sure, yeah. So, and Jesus celestial sea walk. So, like, you know, Jesus walks on water, right? Well, the problem is Orion walks on water 700 years before Jesus does, and he's literally, if you look at him in the stars, his front foot is in the river constellation. In fact, the front foot of Orion and Eridanus' initial star is the same star. So when you look at his cuneiform titles, you get Dingir Damu. It just means the god's son, as in S-O-N, like the S-O-N god.
Wow.
Sun god, right? But his other title is Mul Sukal, which means, it literally means messenger. But Sukal also means anointed one. It means, and that's, of course, you translate anointed one out of the Sumerian and you get Christ, So when you look at all the cuneiform titles, right? So you can write Dingir, Damu, you can write the Mul Sukal means the constellation messenger. You're right. They're coming right out of star atlases. So you write all the alternate readings. You get the Son of God, the Anointed One, or Christ, treads upon the sea. And how did they know Jesus did that? Look up in the stars. You can see a picture of a guy named the Son of God and the Christ walking on water in the stars. In fact, every time you see Orion, he's walking on water.
Right, and then it's like, and then on the other side of the sky, because I know Ophiuchus,
yeah,
who's also Asclepius. You don't see Orion and that constellation on the sky at the same time because they're on opposite sides.
Right.
So I'm wondering if at certain times they're identifying Jesus with the healer, with the serpent bearer, and then on the other times of the night he's identifying with Ryan walking on water. I wonder if that's going on. Or
I would bet money on that.
Yeah.
I would bet money on that. It's just, it takes so long to look up all this stuff and to put all this together that
I think it's a good hypothesis to start with, though.
Oh yeah, I would. If I had, eternal time, I'd love to do that. And so you got Orion walking on water, 700 years for Jesus. His name's Son God and Son of God. You could translate it as Son of God. He's also the Christ walking on water. So that gives Orion a whole new name. So when Matthew, Mark, and John report the Jesus walking on water story, they're looking at that tableau. And wordplay on all the constellations that comprise that tableau give you the differences in the story. And they're nutty. Like Matthew says, oh, well, Peter hopped out of the boat and he was walking on water for a little while too.
Right.
With Jesus. And then he sank. That's in the stars as wordplay. And Mark goes 648 in Mark. Oh, he meant to walk by them. So according to Mark, Jesus walks right by the boat. I guess he turned around. Or was he teasing them? Oh, you guys are going to, it looks like you're going to drown. Oh, just kidding. I was going to save you. Just kidding. And then he turns around and saves them. Like what's going on here? You know what I mean?
Do you think that I've heard this before. I want to hear what you think. The Crux constellation is engulfed by the Centaur constellation. Do you think that the Centaurion or the Centaurion in the Bible, who's guarding Jesus on the cross, is a play on that?
Absolutely, I could absolutely believe that. I could absolutely believe that. Absolutely,
especially after everything you've just showed me. Now I'm almost convinced that's what's happening. You have a centaur who's standing in front of Jesus crucified, and he's the last person to be mentioned before the crucifixion happens.
That's a really interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. That would make a lot of sense. Would make a lot of sense. And if I could just go one more time, even the boat's up there too, the disciples' boat's up there too. But what I wanted to mention is, remember in John's version, you get a second miracle. So remember, Jesus is walking on water. He's about 3.5, 4 miles out from the shore. And remember, the Sea of Galilee is about 7 or 8 miles wide. So when they take Jesus in, the boat instantly teleports to the other side of the lake. So that means it instantly teleported 3.5, 4 miles. Is it the Jolly Roger? Is it like the teleporter in Star Trek? Like, who wouldn't have written that down? Yeah, we got in the boat and instantly we were on the shore. Like, whoa, nobody writes that down, right? And so the reason John wrote it down, you can read it as wordplay in this stellar tableau. So anyway, so Jesus Christ in the guise of Orion walks on water. Matthew, Mark, and John record that story. Luke never does. And then Quran is the celestial tablet preserved in heaven. Two passages from the Quran make that claim. Surah 43:4 and Surah 85:22. So, you got to remember, again, I talked about it earlier, but the Quran is dictated to Muhammad by Salman al-Farsi, and he's a magi. He's a magus. He's one of the guys that came to Jesus' birth that could read the stars. He's one of them, and so he's dictating these myths to Muhammad day and night. Muhammad has got an incredible mind. His ability to retain oral literature is incredible, but the pagan holdouts that wouldn't convert to Islam were they're recycling myths of the ancients. And off the top of my head, I forget the Arabic for it, but you see vestiges of it in some of the Quranic chapters. So Surah 53 is Al-Najm, the star. Surah 54, Al-Qamar, the moon. Surah 85, Al-Buruj, the zodiac. Surah 91, Al-Shams, the sun. They're celestial chapters. And it just says, wait a minute, what's going on here? So one of the things that's really interesting in polytheistic pre-Islam is that you see these stone niches cut into the walls. You'll see they literally look like squares cut, or sometimes rectangles. They almost look like what we would. They're in the shape of picture frames, is what they look like. But they've been chipped out of the rock, and then you put the image of the deity into it and worship the image of the deity. This is the Nabatean goddess from Petra. This is from the Temple of the Wind God, the Winged Lion. I actually had 2 field seasons there when I was earlier in my career. But
this is from Petra, the city.
Yeah, Petra. Yeah. So
Indiana Jones, right?
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't really like that. It's a little. So yeah, I had to. I was sort of the grunt of the assistant to the head archaeologist when I was with BYU there. So you have to do all the crap work. So you got to pick up everybody at the airport and get them hotel rooms and all that kind of stuff and get their food and all that. So you do all the archaeology too. But one of the things that's interesting is the Quran says that it is Gabriel dictates the Quran. The angel Gabriel dictates the Quran to Muhammad, and he said the Quran is founded on a celestial tablet that's kept in heaven. Well, Cuneiform Star Atlas says there's one of them up there. So remember that. We go back to that Pegasus square, man. You got to love this constellation. It's really distinct in the stars, right? It's represented by that square cuneiform sign Lagab, right? Well, Lagab can represent. It's a constellation. It can be read Muleu, which literally means the constellation tablet or the celestial tablet, and it can also be read A, which means to name. It can also be read because it's read A, it means reciting. So you get the celestial tablet named reciting. And that's what the Quran is. The Quran, literally, Al-Quran means the recital or it's the recitation. You could translate it. That's exactly what Lagab means. It has one of its reading means, you know, celestial tablet, and it means the reciting. Now, what's really interesting, in some instances, the Pegasus square is described as U-Ilu. It literally means this field constellation is the god. It's the god. So I'm like, wait a minute. U-Ilu would be Pegasus square is the god. That's what Allah means. Allah means the God. That's literally what it means.
Yeah.
And you can find it embedded in that Pegasus Square constellation. And I wonder if that's where those little niches I was talking about, that cut into the stone in polytheistic Arabia, they are um, they're called Beetles. They literally mean house of the god because you carved them in, and then you maybe go on a trading mission, and you would put an image of your god up. You'd pray to your god. You'd tithe to your local your local temple, and then you would go about your business. But I'm wondering if that's where it came from, and if really Allah is the God, if this Pegasus square constellation represents Allah, who's never represented in imagery. So
That's mind blowing.
yeah. So anyway, that's it. I hope I wasn't too pedantic.
No, this is amazing. This is amazing.
So, um, so I can. I don't know if you got a full screen there. I don't know if you want to. That's the Celestial Code of Scripture. So anything you want to do now, I'm free to chat or talk about or questions.
Yeah, this has been just great. By the way, the links in the description and in the comments for the book, if you want to dig more into this. I guess I just have a couple questions. I would say,
Yeah.
You mentioned how there's different meanings for these words. They're different interpretations. The same logograph in cuneiform, but different words in different languages. Is that what you're saying?
What they mean is, so you get a Sumerian logogram can have multiple meanings. It can have, but what
It's
I'm trying
all
to get
Sumerian.
at,
It's all still Sumerian, but they just represented the same way.
yeah, Sumerian and Akkadian, it's really a bilingual text.
Gotcha.
If you learn Akkadian, you've learned Sumerian. But what I'm saying is you've got guys like Daniel that know Babylonian, Assyrian, and Hebrew, and probably another. They probably know Aramaic as well, or some other language.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, you know what? We just got freed. We are going to go out and we're going to write our own form of mythology. And all we got to do is look at the stars and read the pictures and the puns, and it'll dictate our primordial history. And there's where you get the Garden of Eden story. There's where you get an alternate version of the flood story.
Sargon of Akkad and Moses and all that stuff.
Yes. And the same exact thing happens to Moses that happened to Sargon, 1,000 years earlier.
And then like we already mentioned, Abraham, the ram in the thicket. You see the idols. It's all coming together. This is all making perfect sense to me. What you're saying. There's just so much to dig into. Every area that you go into is a whole universe of information that you can find on. It's just there's just that much stuff. Let me ask you this though: your own personal, it's like forget what scholars say, forget what evidence says. What do you think? Like for example, if someone had a gun to your head right now, you have to get this right. You have to guess on your own. You don't care what anyone else thinks. This is your life. When do you think the Bible got written?
I think the Old Testament, I think it's pretty well established that the Old Testament was written down during and after the Babylonian exile. So you're talking 6th century BC and maybe even into the 5th century BC. Now, that doesn't mean there were oral traditions floating around that were retained by word of mouth. Gotcha. Like, I don't doubt that Samson was a real guy, but what I'm saying is, the story of Samson, they had no idea. By the time they went to write down the Bible, the old, the Pentateuch, they had no idea what Samson did. They knew his name's Little Son. They're like, wait, let's look up the stars. Oh, there's a guy named Little Son. Well, what does he do? Well, he's a warrior. Oh, and there's a jawbone of a donkey there. Well, according to the Lamashi writing, he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. and then a spring forms and all that, and that's all up there too. The word spring is up there, and
And so
all
you,
that
you
stuff.
think a similar thing happened with Jesus of Nazareth? His name's Jesus of Nazareth. He does some things that people think are great. He gets a big following, but then they attribute to all these mythology to him, and that's how you get the Gospels.
Yeah, because they're writing it down after the person has died. They're not writing down eyewitness testimony.
Right.
The Gospels are written down. All of the eyewitnesses are dead,
Right.
but they, unlike today, like we would do archaeology to find out what happened for proof, right? They wouldn't. They would look at pictures and this, like, this isn't that hard to find out how Jesus was born if you were thinking like Matthew and Luke. You're like, there's going to be a picture of a monumental event like Jesus's birth in the stars. There's no chance we're going to miss that. There's no way. And that's what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is they're historic personages, but when you get into the supernatural, when you get to the miracle stories, every one of the miracles is based on this Lamashi writing, this pictographic and literary punning in the stars.
And
And that's what the book's about.
do you think Revelation is doing the same thing, but actually looking forward in this sense?
Yeah, I even passed. I mean, several of my articles have already gone through like peer review and stuff. So like Jesus Sea Walk, like that passed peer review. Another one I did, I think, was at European Journal of Science and Theology, passed peer review.
Wow.
And it's the woman, dragon, and the child scene, and that's directly out of Mesopotamian astrological tablets. That's just, there's a woman in the constellation in the form of Virgo. There's that child star Regulus, and then on the other side of the child star is Hydra, the seven-headed red dragon. It's a seven-headed red dragon. Like, oh, what does John see? Oh, he sees a seven-headed red dragon. So, and a woman and child, and the idea that she's standing on the moon, that's all encrypted into the cuneiform. It's like, it's not actually that hard. It's just time consuming to try to unpack all that. So.
Absolutely, and that's why I really appreciate you. And we got to get you back on for some more of these conversations, and maybe we can focus on a certain area and try to hone in on one of these things that you mentioned.
Yeah, like a specific area, because basically I got an oral agreement with Monkfish that every one of these chapters spins off into their own book. So then there'll be one book on Jesus' celestial sea rock. There'll be one book on the Star of Bethlehem and the stellar tableau of Jesus, that kind of stuff. Wow. So I'm going to try to do a deep dive into every facet of the chapters.
And we're going to be here buying these books, that's for sure, and that's definitely
so.
Yeah.
You're going to try, go all the way. Otherwise, don't even start. If you're going to try, go all the way. This could mean losing girlfriends, wives, relatives, jobs, and maybe your mind.
Search